The image you are about to see is not a landscape. It isn't a portrait of a hero in a clean uniform. It isn't a painting designed to stir your soul with beauty. In 1863, a small, grainy photograph began to circulate through the hands of a divided America. When people first held it, they often stopped breathing. They saw a man sitting quietly, his back turned to the lens. His name was Peter, but his back didn't look like human skin. It looked like a topographic map of agony. It was carved, layer over layer, with thick, raised ridges of keloid scars that crisscrossed like the roots of an ancient, tortured tree. For decades, the powerful had polished a lie, telling the world that slavery was a necessary and even gentle institution. This single photograph didn't just challenge that lie, it incinerated it. No speech could counter it. No politician could debate it. This was the raw physical receipt of a nation's greatest sin. But the most incredible part isn't the scars. It's how Peter got them, how he escaped the men who gave them to him, and how he turned his literal wounds into a weapon that would help break the chains of millions. Before the photograph shocked the nation, there was a heavy, suffocating silence. It is 1863, and America is a house divided, bleeding out on battlefields from Virginia to Tennessee. Brother is killing brother. The North and South are locked in a death grip. But for many living in the comfort of northern cities like New York or Boston, the true cause of the war still feels distant.
They had heard the stories, of course. They had read the abolitionist pamphlets and heard the fiery sermons in drafty churches. But words are easy to ignore when they describe a horror you've never seen. In the drawing rooms of the North, many wanted to believe the great lie. This was the carefully crafted propaganda of the Southern plantocracy. The idea that slavery was a paternal system. They claimed enslaved people were well-fed, content, and even loyal to their masters. They called it a necessary evil that had become a positive good.
Even in the North, there was a desperate desire to believe this. Because if the stories of brutality were true, it meant that the very fabric of American wealth, the cotton in their clothes, the sugar in their tea, was soaked in blood. It meant that a civilized nation was presiding over a slow-motion massacre.
But deep in the humid heart of Louisiana, on a plantation surrounded by tangled swamps and thick Spanish moss, the reality didn't look like a political debate. It looked like the man named Peter. For Peter, life wasn't measured in years, but in the rhythm of the whip. On plantations like his, the overseer didn't just manage labor, they managed souls through the calculated use of pain. Work began in the gray light before dawn and ended long after the sun dipped below the horizon. Cotton, sugarcane, rice, these weren't just crops, they were masters that demanded everything. If you slowed down because of the heat, you were punished. If you looked an overseer in the eye, you were punished. If you dared to maintain a shred of human dignity, the whip was there to strip it away. But deep in the humid heart of Louisiana, on a plantation surrounded by tangled swamps and thick Spanish moss, the reality didn't look like a political debate. It looked like the man named Peter. For Peter, life wasn't measured in years, but in the rhythm of the whip. On plantations like his, the overseer didn't just manage labor, they managed souls through the calculated use of pain. Work began in the gray light before dawn and ended long after the sun dipped below the horizon. Cotton, sugarcane, rice, these weren't just crops, they were masters that demanded everything. If you slowed down because of the heat, you were punished. If you looked an overseer in the eye, you were punished. If you dared to maintain a shred of human dignity, the whip was there to strip it away.
In this world, the whip was a tool of discipline, but for Peter, it became an instrument of mutilation. At some point in his life, he was subjected to a beating so savage, so sustained, that it transcended mere punishment. It was an attempt to break his spirit by literally shredding his flesh. The wounds were deep. They were left to fester in the Louisiana heat. They became infected, they healed, and then they were likely reopened by more work or more lashes. The result was a back that no longer looked human. The scars didn't just heal in thin lines, they erupted into thick, raised keloid ridges, a permanent anatomical record of every strike, every scream, and every moment of agony he had endured. For years, Peter carried this evidence under a rough burlap shirt. To the world, he was just another laborer, but beneath that fabric, he carried the physical proof that the great lie of the South was a fantasy.
The silence was about to end, because Peter was no longer willing to be a secret. He was waiting for a moment, a single crack in the armor of the Confederacy, to show the world exactly what had been done to him. For Peter, the decision to leave wasn't just a move toward freedom, it was a run for his life. In the spring of 1863, the air in Louisiana was thick with the scent of blooming jasmine and the rut of the swamps. But for an enslaved man, that air was heavy with something else, the constant grinding pressure of the overseer's gaze.
The plantation where Peter labored was a fortress of fear. The walls weren't made of stone, they were made of distance, dogs, and the absolute power of the white men who owned him. But Peter had reached a breaking point. The scars on his back weren't just old wounds, they were a map of every reason he had to leave.
One night, under the cover of a moonless sky, Peter slipped away. He didn't have a compass, he didn't have a map. He only had the North Star and a desperate, burning hope. But the South did not let its property walk away easily. Almost immediately, the hounds were loosed.
Imagine the sound of bloodhounds baying in the distance, their voices echoing through the cypress trees. Peter knew that if they caught him, the punishment wouldn't just be another whipping, it would likely be his end. To survive, he had to become a ghost. He plunged into the waist-deep water of the Louisiana bayous, moving through stagnant pools where alligators and cottonmouth snakes were the least of his worries. He carried onions in his pockets, rubbing them raw against the soles of his feet and his tattered clothes. He knew the sharp, pungent scent would confuse the dogs' noses, masking the smell of his fear and his sweat. He smeared thick, black swamp mud over his skin to blend into the shadows. For 10 days, Peter moved like a shadow through a landscape designed to kill him. He didn't eat. He barely slept. Every snap of a twig was a heartbeat skipped. Every rustle of leaves was a potential captor.
Then, through the trees, he saw something he had only heard of in whispers. It wasn't a plantation. There were no overseers. Instead, there were rows of white tents and the blue uniforms of the Union Army. Peter had reached the encampment of the 47th Massachusetts Infantry in Baton Rouge. When he stumbled into the camp, he was skeletal. His clothes were nothing more than rags held together by swamp mud and dried blood. He was a man who had literally crawled out of hell.
The Union soldiers looked at him with a mix of curiosity and pity. To them, he was just another contraband, the legal term used for enslaved people who fled to Union lines. They gave him food, they gave him water, but it wasn't until a routine medical examination
that the atmosphere in that camp shifted forever. A Union doctor told Peter to take off his shirt so he could be checked for disease and injury. Peter moved slowly. He gripped the rough fabric and pulled it over his head.
The room went deathly silent. The doctors and soldiers standing there had seen the horrors of the battlefield. They had seen limbs lost to cannon fire and faces torn by minie balls. But they had never seen anything like this. Peter's back wasn't just scarred, it was a landscape of brutality. The skin was raised in thick, crisscrossing ridges that looked like a bird's-eye view of a plowed field. It was as if someone had tried to rewrite his entire history using a whip as a pen.
One of the men in the room realized that words would never be enough to describe what they were seeing. They sent for a photographer. Peter sat on a wooden chair, turned his back to the camera, and looked slightly away. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He simply sat in the quiet dignity of a man who was finally, for the first time in his life, the owner of his own story. The shutter clicked. The flash of the early camera flared, and in that millisecond, a private agony became a public indictment.
The photograph did not stay in that medical tent in Baton Rouge. It couldn't. It was as if the image itself had a soul that demanded to be seen. Within weeks, the glass plate negative was copied, and the Scourged Back began its journey across a fractured country.
In the 1860s, photography was still a miracle of science. People believed what they saw in a photograph in a way they never believed a sketch or a poem. You couldn't fake a photograph back then. It was the absolute frozen truth. When the image reached the desks of editors in New York and Philadelphia, it hit like a physical blow. The famous magazine Harper's Weekly, the most influential publication in America, prepared to run a feature on the man they called Gordon, the name Peter had used during his escape. When the issue hit the newsstands on July 4, 1863, the reaction was a collective gasp from the North. For years, the abolitionist movement had been searching for a way to show the silent millions what slavery actually looked like. They had the words of Frederick Douglass and the stories of Harriet Beecher Stowe, but now they had this. They had Peter's back. Abolitionists turned the photo into carte de visite, small, palm-sized cards that people would trade and collect. They were passed around in parlors, handed out at political rallies, and pinned to the walls of union recruiting offices. The message was unspoken but deafening. This is what we are fighting against. This is what order looks like in the South. The impact on the war effort was immediate. In the North, many white men who had been hesitant to fight for someone else's freedom looked at those ridges of scar tissue and realized this wasn't just a political disagreement over states' rights. It was a moral emergency. But the photograph did something even more powerful. It spoke to the thousands of black men who were still deciding if they could trust the Union Army. Seeing Peter, a man who had survived the worst the South could do and had come out the other side, was a call to arms. Peter didn't just sit for a photo and then fade into history. He did something that terrified the Confederacy even more than that photograph. He put on a blue uniform. The man whose back had been treated like a canvas for cruelty now carried a musket. He joined the United States Colored Troops. He became a guide for Union soldiers, using his knowledge of the Louisiana swamps to lead them through the very territory where he had once been hunted like an animal. He went from being property to being a protector. He went from being a victim to being a soldier in the Army of Liberation. The man who had been whipped for his identity was now fighting to erase the system that held the whip. As the photograph continued to circulate, it began to change the very goal of the Civil War. It was no longer just about keeping the map of the United States together. Because of Peter's scars, the war became a crusade to ensure that no human being would ever again have their history written in blood on their own skin. The war eventually ended.
The smoke cleared from the battlefields, the shackles were officially broken, and the nation began the long, agonizing process of trying to heal. But for Peter, and for the millions he represented, the healing was never going to be simple. While the laws of the land had changed, the memory of the whip remained etched into his very being.
Peter's journey as a soldier took him to the siege of Port Hudson, where he fought with a bravery that shamed those who had once called him subhuman. He survived the war, but like so many who emerge from the shadows of history, his later years are a blur. Some say he returned to Louisiana. Others believe he sought a new life far from the soil that had tasted his blood. But in a way, Peter's physical life after the war is only half the story. The other half belongs to the photograph itself. The image of the Scourged Back didn't disappear when the Union won. It became a permanent ghost in the American conscience. For over 160 years, it has sat in our history books, staring back at us from the pages. It serves as a silent, unwavering witness. Every time someone tries to sanitize the past, every time a textbook tries to suggest that slavery wasn't that bad, Peter is there. His back is the ultimate rebuttal to every lie ever told about the glory of the Old South.
We look at that photo today, and we feel a mix of horror and profound respect. We see the worst of humanity in those scars, yes, but we also see the best of it in the man who carried them. Peter didn't just survive, he triumphed. He took the marks of his shame and turned them into a mirror for a nation to see its own reflection. He forced America to look at what it had become so that it could finally decide what it wanted to be. One man, one moment in a chair, one click of a shutter.
History is often told through the lives of kings, presidents, and generals. But sometimes, the most powerful story isn't found in a throne room or a battlefield. Sometimes, the most important story in the world is written on the back of a man who refused to be broken. Peter's scars are no longer just his. They are a part of us. They remind us that the truth can be buried, it can be beaten, and it can be hidden in the deepest swamps, but it can never be destroyed. And once the world finally sees it, there is no going back. The truth doesn't just inform us, it changes us. And because of Peter, the world was changed forever.